But we begin tonight a week out from the first and historically the earliest presidential debate between Biden and Trump, and how it will set the tone for the final months of the presidential campaign. Over at the New York Times, Trump whisperer Maggie Haberman has new reporting on how Trump is preparing, or not, to face President Biden next week. Cue the endless speculation by the media industry, of which we are a part, over Trump's reported policy sessions, the lack of stand-ins or role-playing, who stands where, who gets the last word, or who has the last gaffe. There will be lots of talk about Biden and Trump making history in the first presidential debate between an incumbent and a former president. But that's not the only historical tidbit to go in the books. And I would argue that the most important piece of information leading up to this debate is that Trump is an adjudicated criminal and sexual assaulter, and he's running for president anyway. How is that a thing that's happening and being treated as if it's normal? Trump is an actual felon. A convicted criminal is about to be debating on the presidential stage for the first time in American history. And he's waving around a threat of pardoning other criminals, namely the hundreds of violent criminals convicted in connection with the attack that he inspired on the U.S. Capitol, where about 140 police officers were injured as insurrectionists brandished firearms, stun guns, bear spray, axes, hatchets, and even a massive Trump sign. These people were waving the Confederate flag and bludgeoning people with poles carrying the American flag upside down or right side up. So given that context, who really cares what his debate prep is? Especially given that Donald Trump doesn't really prep for anything, or so he says, because remember, Trump's public image is what matters to him the most. But there's also an inconvenient truth interfering with that image. Not only is Trump a criminal, as determined by a jury, he's also someone who is arguably in mental and perhaps even cognitive decline. It's pretty clear if you just listen to the man.
Under our leadership, the forgotten man and woman will be forgotten no longer, and it wasn't forgotten. Man and woman 4 years ago was not forgotten. I hope the military revolts at the voting booth. By the way, a lot of shark attacks lately. Do you notice that? A lot of shark. I watched some guys justifying it today. Well, they weren't really that angry. They bit off the young lady's leg because of the fact that they were not hungry, but they misunderstood who she was. The water starts flooding in. I'm getting concerned. But then I look 10 yards to my left, and there's a shark over there. These teleprompters are just gonzo, folks.
It does seriously beg the question, is this man okay? The latest look behind the curtain of Trump's mental decline comes from the new book, Apprentice in Wonderland, How Donald Trump and Mark Burnett Took America Through the Looking Glass. Author and Variety co-editor-in-chief Ramin Satuda, who interviewed Trump a half dozen times in writing this book, provides the receipts. Here is exclusive audio from one of the interviews where they spoke about the late comedian Joan Rivers and her appearance on The Celebrity Apprentice.
Joan said she was a Republican. Did you know that?
I thought she might have been a Republican.
Yeah.
I know one thing, she voted for me, according to what she said.
Okay, well, there's just one minor problem with that. Joan Rivers died 2 years before the 2016 election, a little too early for early voting. And just as they were talking about Rivers, Trump seemed to claim he had to wrap up their discussion because he had pressing matters dealing with Afghanistan, as if he still had some foreign policy powers after leaving the White House.
The reason I'm doing this and devoting a lot of time to it, I have to get back up because, I'm doing the whole thing with the Afghanistan. Has he blown that Afghanistan?
Ramin Satuda joins me now. Congratulations on the book, Ramin. Let me ask you just a couple of leading-in questions. Had you interviewed Donald Trump before 2021? This is after he left the presidency. Had you interviewed him before?
Thank you for having me on, Joy.
Sure.
I have interviewed him before. In fact, this book started because when I was a young reporter at Newsweek in 2004, I was in my early 20s, starting to cover different beats as a journalist. One of the things I started to cover at Newsweek was The Apprentice. And as a young journalist, I always had such great access to Donald Trump because what he loved more than anything else was talking to reporters. So at the time, he didn't have a publicist. He didn't really have anyone who was handling his press inquiries. You would call his office, and before I could even turn on my tape recorder, I would be on the phone with Donald Trump. And as a young reporter, that was great to have such direct access to someone I was covering. The star of a reality show was very helpful, so I could always get him on the phone and get an interview with him whenever I needed one.
That is really good information to have, because you then are in a good position to tell us how he's changed in the time that you used to interview him when he was on The Apprentice and when you interviewed him for your book, for these more recent encounters.
And it was always interesting to me during his first term as president because I wondered that. I wondered, has the presidency changed him? Is he evolved? Is he more reflective about what's happening in the world? And the truth of the matter is the Donald Trump I sat down with for 6 times after he left the White House is the same man that was playing a reality star on The Apprentice. He has not changed at all. He loves to talk. He loves to hear himself talk, and he loves to be at the center of the spotlight.
I've seen a couple of your other interviews. You talked about my friends Chris Hayes and of course Nicole Wallace yesterday and today. And one of the things that was striking to me, and I want to go two directions here. One of them is that you talked about that point, that he still lives in The Apprentice, that's still where his mind goes. And I ask you that because those of us who have seasoned citizens in our lives, older folks who are starting to lose a little cognitive capacity, and I have some of those in my life, one of the things that you do notice is that they go, where their mind goes is to a place where they're comfortable, when they can't remember their words and when they can't remember other things that they want to recall but they can't. It's easy to kind of go right to where you are comfortable. Do you sense that he is sort of mentally stuck in The Apprentice?
Absolutely. He is still living in a world in which he is the star of The Apprentice. There were times when he would talk about the show where it almost felt like he was talking in the present tense. He actually was talking in the present tense, as if he was going to go back and do another season, as if the cameras were still following him along, as if he was still playing the character. And what was interesting was that his memory of The Apprentice was much clearer than his memory of what he did in the White House. He stumbled with the chronology of recent events. He stumbled in terms of what had happened in terms of our interviews. When we spoke back to back to back, he couldn't really remember talking to me between our first and second conversations. And his short-term memory was not clear. It was very foggy, and he had issues remembering things.
What does he think of the presidency? Because it seems that you tell a story about him having still framed ratings from The Apprentice, both in Mar-a-Lago and in his other properties, and that's the thing he seems most proud of. Did he ever talk about anything about being commander-in-chief, about being president, about being the leader of the military, the leader of the free world, anything like that?
We had a variety of discussions, and he referenced the presidency often and frequently, but he never spoke specifically about his accomplishments other than saying things like he helped create the vaccine, he helped save lives, but he was not interested in talking about what he did in terms of legislative accomplishments. He was not interested in talking about governing. He was interested in the fact that when he was in the White House, one story he told me was that when he was in the White House, he saw someone on TV, and he called the White House switchboard and asked to patch the operator to patch him through to that person, and they were able to do it immediately. And he thought that was really, really, really cool, the fact that he could get someone on the phone quickly as President of the United States of America.
The clip that you played was of him thinking Joan Rivers voted for him, and she was quite dead by then. He has frequently made it sound like he thinks he ran for president against Barack Obama. He seems to be stuck on Barack Obama. Barack Obama seems to live rent-free in his head. Do you get a sense of why that is? I mean, we know that there are other reports, this isn't your reporting, but that he has dropped the N-word. Michael Cohen has said that he did that. There is somebody who used to work on The Apprentice who's now free of an NDA who has said that. Do you think that he's motivated, or did he seem motivated by racial animus? What seemed to motivate him?
I think that he has always been someone, starting with the birtherism claims, he has always been someone who's stoked issues with Barack Obama, and it's no secret that he thinks about Barack Obama frequently. He told me in my book, what was interesting was that he talked about how he really wished he had run in 2012. And he thinks that in 2012, if he had run for the office of the president, he would have defeated Obama. And he told me that he thought it would have been easier to defeat Obama in Obama's second term than it was when he had to defeat Hillary Clinton. He actually made it seem like Hillary Clinton was a stronger contender in 2016 than Obama would have been in 2012. And it is interesting. You do get new insights into his resentment of the Obamas. But I also think it goes back to star power. The Obamas were cool. They were widely beloved. They were like movie star presidents. And that is something that Donald Trump really aspires to and wants to have the American public really love him and appreciate him and feel the love from everyone across the country.
And that is the second place I wanted to go, that he seems to be an incredibly needy person, a person who needs celebrity, who needs fame, who needs adulation. He's envious of Barack Obama having it and of anyone who seemed to have it.